Thank you, I think. I want to lower expectations. Remember, things change. I'm going to talk to you today about the difference between confidence, trust, hope, and faith. They're all ways that we have expectations about what's going to happen in our lives. And they all kind of sometimes seem like the same word: confidence, trust, hope, and faith. We often use them interchangeably. But I've noticed a difference. Confidence is based on the scientific probability of something happening. Trust is confidence based on personal experience. Hope is longing for the best outcome. And faith is believing that things will turn out the way you think it should, no matter what happens. Which of these work best for you? What situations call for one more than the other? I begin with confidence. Actually, the topic, confidence. As a psychology major in college, I had to take a course in research statistics. It's a mathematical way to analyze all the data you've gathered from surveys and drug trials and various subjects. Our first exam was very hard, and interpreting the results was even harder. Because our professor, instead of giving us a letter grade, A, B, C, or D, or even a percentage, like 75% correct, 50%, 100%, he gave us a number which indicated our standard deviation from the mean. And he told us, if you don't understand your grade, maybe you should drop the class. I had a -1. I didn't quite understand it, but I did know I needed to study harder. See, because science has a method, and it tries to be as sure as possible. And scientists design experiments with one variable. And you run a control group without the variable and an experimental group that contains the variable. And you measure the difference. For example, you might compare a normal coin flip with one using a trick coin. Now, the normal coin will on average be 50% heads or 50% tails. But if you flipped a coin 100 times, it could vary as much as 60-40. And so if you ran 100 trials and plotted all the outcomes, most of the outcomes would be 50-50, and some would be 60-40 or 40-60, and a few or still would be 70-30 heads or tails. And this forms what is called a bell curve, that most of the most common response happens in the middle, and the least frequent things happen on the edges. Then you try the trials with the trick coin, and you notice that the bell curve is kind of lopsided towards heads. And so you say, well, that's different. But then someone says, is it a significant difference? And you can eyeball it and say, yeah, it looks pretty significant to me. But the mathematicians have come up with all sorts of formulas and stuff to actually see if it is mathematically significant. And they take your data and you plug it into these formulas, and you get a confidence score. And a confidence score of 95 means that one result would have happened by chance only 5% of the time. You can be 95% sure that the difference between this and that is in the variable. That's the minimum to get published in most scientific journals. So when you hear about something causing cancer or autism, the initial reports are anecdotal. People say, gee, that happened to me. But then people go through scientific studies and say, nah, it really wasn't a fact. It might have appeared to be, but it really isn't scientifically, statistically significant. The standard is very high. But in our everyday lives, we do not have the time or inclination to run an experiment on every variable of our lives. If any of you have ever been driving with a friend or a spouse and you want to actually say, what is the quickest way to get from here to there? That conversation can last a marriage. Because every time you're proven right, you say, see, I told you. And when you're proven wrong, you say, well, there were unforeseen variables. And you don't really have in most of your decisions, like how to get from here to there, time to do a scientific study to find out what is absolutely the best way to go. And so it comes down to trust. Do you trust the person who's leading you? Do you trust the person who you've asked to do a job? Do you trust that a politician might actually mean what they say? Or do you trust that they don't mean what they say and you're glad of it? See, most of research indicates that humans are causing climate change. And lawyers and publicists for polluters focus on that small amount of improbable outcomes and create doubt. They ask a scientist, are you 100% confident? And no competent scientist will ever say they are 100% confident. They will say things like, most of the models predict, and the mathematical formulas for forming confidence never reach 100. They approach it, but never reach it. So if a scientist says they are 99.9999999% sure, the skeptic will say, aha, there's doubt. But at some point, people begin to trust science. What the scientist says might confirm the anecdotal evidence they have gathered in their lifetime, because it just kind of seems to me that winters are getting milder and hurricanes are growing stronger. But I personally have not conducted any studies myself, and after I passed my statistics class, I don't want to run another statistical formula for the rest of my life. So I trust that these people are following the scientific method. But trust itself sometimes can be a variable. Back in the 1990s, I was a case manager for people living with HIV. T cells in our blood fight disease. HIV destroys those T cells. And back in the 90s, there were very few drugs that helped increase the T cells. And I was reading research on a new drug called D4T. And an initial study showed that D4T works significantly better in people who took it than those who took no medication and those that took a sugar pill or placebo. And I looked at the graph. And here were the people who took nothing. Here were the people who took the placebo. And here were the people who took D4T. And I looked at this graph and I said, my goodness, most of the difference is between the person who was taking nothing and the person who was taking the placebo. Now, D4T did significantly better than the placebo, but I saw that most of the effect was from somebody desperately clinging for their life and having someone with a white coat saying, here, this may help. Trusting in something, actually, it increases its chance of proving trustworthy. If you trust the person, they are most likely going to live up to those trusts. If you ask them to defend everything they're doing all the time, they will get suspicious and they will stop telling you what they're doing. Because the mistrust just ruins that relationship. And so trust itself has an impact on outcome. Consumer confidence is an economic term that tries to measure trust. When consumers trust the economy, they spend money and the economy continues to grow. If they do not trust the economy, they spend less. They invest in bonds rather than buying stocks and companies, or they don't spend money, and these behaviors slow the economy. In the 1990s, people were investing in all these new computer companies, and there was a dot-com revolution. Money was spent freely, and much money was made with nary a product to be seen. Until Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan wondered about irrational exuberance. It was a word that was much like many of his phrases that was so convoluted that it usually just went through the many reports and didn't get noticed. But somehow this one got noticed. Irrational exuberance. And it was enough to pop the dot-com bubble. People started to say, wait a minute, maybe I should think before I spend money. And the whole thing came crashing down. And the prices fell back in line with economic factors. Hope is even more ethereal than trust. It may have little basis in reality, yet it still motivates. I hope for peace. I hope for peace despite all the evidence that the history of humankind shows us. I hope for rationality, although it appears many people would prefer to live in fantasy. And maybe this hope in itself is irrational. I hope for the end of diseases, even though I know everyone will die. Hope is aspirational. It's what we long for. And it may motivate us to work towards a goal and open our eyes to new possibilities. Hope is important not in what it does to the outcome that you're seeking, but what it does to you. The difference between hoping for peace and going through life hoping to win every fight to make sure you're not taken advantage of. It might not change the whole scope of the world, but it will affect your life of how you approach each situation. Now, faith is different than hope. It is a certainty that reinterprets facts. In the Bible, Hebrews 11:1 states, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And in Corinthians, Paul also says, so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And these words are similar to the words of the Buddha, who says we live in illusion and the appearance of things. And this idea that don't trust what you see and feel with your own eyes, see with the eyes of faith. For confidence, seeing is believing. But for faith, believing is seeing. And so if you believe that everyone is basically evil, you will continue to see that everyone is basically evil. If you believe that everyone is basically good, you will continue to see that. Faith has a confirmation bias. If you say that, the end of the world is coming, my goodness, whether you believe it's coming in the sense of God or in the sense of pollution, that every data point that gets put into your faith structure is either affirming or discounted. That doesn't really count. That can be explained away, or, see, I told you. Any particular storm is just a data point of evidence for or against global warming. But you can't say that one storm in and of itself proves it or disproves it, because confidence doesn't work that way. It has to collect all the information and see a trend. But faith works that way all the time. I knew that person would be like that in that meeting. That's why I prodded them to be like that in that meeting. One can believe in capitalism or Marxism. Each justifies themselves versus the other. Freud thought we were regulated by unseen internal forces of id, ego, and superego. B.F. Skinner and Pavlov that believed that we were regulated by external stimuli, the reinforcers. Confidence is trusting what you see. Faith is seeing what you hope for. And we are always walking around with too little information. There isn't time to be certain about every choice we have. And so we rely on trust. And we rely on our hopes. And we rely on our faith. But sometimes we get stuck, and we have to ask, what is real? And what is delusion? How do I know what I know? If we are humble in our knowledge, and we believe that we do not know it all, it creates the possibility for improvement, the growth of compassion and mercy for ourselves and each other. So I ask some of you, when do you rely on confidence, trust, hope, or faith? This is nice. There's a whole new pathways for me to walk along here that I've never walked before.
Sure. Confidence is easy. Every day, all of you drive on the streets around here, and when you come up to a controlled intersection where there's a light and it's green, you have confidence that the people coming the other way are going to stop. If you did not have confidence, you would not go through the light. However, that confidence may be misplaced.
I tend to slow down and get rear-ended at green lights because I don't have much confidence. But that was last week's sermon.
Well, for me, it's kind of like environmental work, which I do a lot of. I have a lot of faith that change will happen, but then I look at the scientific data, and my confidence is definitely shaken.
Well, the count for today was, I believe, 97. And so I had kind of gotten used to there being at least 100 people here. So next Sunday, at least 3 of you need to go home and bring your husbands.
I like hope. I have 2 members, young members of my family, that are fighting cancer, and very young with young children. So my hope is they'll make it.
Mine too. I'm going to be careful here because I don't want to get political, but I do want to say something. It struck me that if you trust in someone and when they say something to you and you trust them, then what they say is trustworthy. And it's always struck me that I don't understand how I can hear what someone says and I perceive it as a straight out lie. And then someone else hears what they say and they absolutely believe, even though there's evidence that's video or audio evidence that that person is lying, but they don't hear it as a lie. But if they find that person, if they believe in that person and they trust that person, they absolutely find that person trustworthy. And it was interesting because that struck me in the sermon today, that it is because of that bias, that sense of having placed belief in that person, faith in that person, that they are not totally delusional. They've just accepted that that person is trustworthy. It helps me understand.
So, okay.
I guess I have a lot of hope, faith, optimism. I see a much better world than the world that was before us. I don't see anything negative. I look at my world compared to my mother's world and know that I'm better off. I look at my mother's world compared to her mother's world, and it was much better off. Over the ages as women, we've gotten a much better world. So I have a lot of faith and hope that it will get better for my daughter and her daughters.
Let us continue this conversation in our coffee hour, which will be coming soon after these words. We have a hymn.
If you would kindly join us in singing hymn